So, Miguel, Christoph, and Cathleen, let's start off straight away with one very important aspect of this, and that's the collective participation aspect of digitalization. We need equal access across the globe. So, Miguel, can you help us understand from the viewpoint of the German Federal Foreign Office, what kinds of infrastructural barriers currently divide the world in a digital sense? Where are those barriers? What are they?
Yeah, I mean, we have in Germany, obviously, the whole discussion about broadband access. We still are working on a single European market in that area. You know, my concern is not so much the infrastructural barrier. Our concern as Foreign Office is more about security aspects. And what we are seeing at an international level, if you look, for example, to Russia, if you look to China, is that we see a more and more nationalistic policy where security is first, and this is something that is challenging economic exchange, which is challenging the possibilities also for international cooperation. And this is something we are looking very closely to, and where we are trying to establish dialogues, cyber dialogues, in order to address these issues.
Okay, so we'll get to the security aspect for sure. We'll get into more detail on that. Christoph, let's stick with, since Miguel mentioned, broadband access. This is something obviously that we're discussing in Germany as well. Connectivity is the sort of foundation for equal access, right? To be able to even access the internet. And yet, 53% of the world's population still actually has none, has no connectivity. So from the GITS point of view, what specifically do you think needs to be done here to quite literally connect the world?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. First of all, I think, yes, you're right. We have a lot to do in investing in access for people. And this is, of course, a lot of infrastructure investments are needed in order to create this access. Even if you have a look that only who has access to energy, to renewable energy, for example, there you will see if you go around the world, especially in the more poorer regions of sub-Saharan Africa or other places, that you have still a lot of problems. But I would not reduce this to the aspect of infrastructure. The aspect of education and of skills is, for me and for us, equally important. I mean, you do not have only this digital divide if you have a look on this on a geographical point of view, so poor countries, rich countries, and so on. But you have it also between men and women, for example. You have much less access of women to internet and other digitalization opportunities, or even if you have a look on the startup scene, so who can make use of new opportunities in the economic arena. There you see that a lot has to be done in education. And of course, like it was said before, cyber resilience is a huge issue which we have to talk about, and startups, economic opportunities. We have to invest in those possibilities for people to make use of new digital opportunities. Yeah.
So we've heard about connectivity, we've heard about energy, education. These are all questions of access. Cathleen, one question of access, or a question that certainly will determine access, is of course something that we've all been reading about in the news, certainly in the last couple of days, and that's net neutrality, the idea of equal traffic management. The US FCC is renegotiating net neutrality. How important do you think it is as a concept for global equal access?
Can hardly be overstated, to be honest. I think it's very clear that net neutrality is the foundation of how the internet has developed so far, and the successes that we've seen in those 25 odd years that we've had the internet wouldn't have been possible without it. If it comes to equality of access, I think it doesn't just end with net neutrality, but if you want to provide opportunity, and without the infrastructure, it's one thing, but yes, it's a very complex challenge. Like, the infrastructure alone won't enable and empower people to actually use the internet. So there's also the education sphere, but there's also regulatory aspects, there's other frameworks that need to be in place. So something that goes with net neutrality also in a, for instance, international gender context is something that we say we should pay attention to equal rating, for instance. So equal rating means there should be no discrimination, there should be no pay for play, there should be no gatekeepers. So if we, for instance, say we want to increase access worldwide, and the United Nations has set goals for that, there's many international declarations that say we need to bridge this digital divide, we need to bring everyone online, then How do we do that? In public-private partnerships is often the answer. But then, is it public investment, or is it private entities that are not just the internet service providers, but also the content providers, which is probably where there might be a clash. That's what we call gatekeepers. So there needs to be a lot of attention being paid if it comes to what sort of access, and especially what quality of access, do we actually want to provide. And that's a question of us being very privileged, where we are arguing here. We're all German standing here, actually. We might want to reconsider some of these things. And net neutrality is just the baseline principle to empower that. Basically.
Baseline principles. So we have a couple of baselines now. We need connectivity, we need education, there needs to be security in an international context. We have net neutrality itself. Let's get into some of these in more detail. So Christoph, I'd like to start off with you. The GITS actually employs a couple of digital technologies, or has a focus on digital technologies with a couple of projects, right? When we think of the Sustainable Development Goals, can you help us understand in what kinds of cooperation projects digital technology could actually internationally actually further some of these goals? On what topics, be it health, be it gender, help us understand where it's actually helpful to think in digital terms.
Yeah. Okay, I think, shall I put it a little bit far away? Yeah. If you have a look first to the chances and opportunities of digitalization, this is what you are talking about, then I would say yes, all social services are affected by digitalization. You can make a lot of use of digital means in order to improve, for example, education, yeah, for e-learning courses, also in difficult circumstances, in fragile contexts, for example. A lot of our projects are happening in fragile contexts. We have an increasing number of states who are characterized as fragile, where it's really difficult also to have people on the ground providing services. So the internet or other digitalization opportunities are giving us a lot of opportunities to improve services for people who do not get services. Yeah? Or have a look on the refugee camps or other situations where things like this is needed. The same is true definitely in the health sector. Digital health is a huge topic we are working on. Improve also access to health services, work on referral system, work on other examples to improve the situation for people who do not get access yet or who do not have access yet. And the other thing, the third thing I would mention is what I said before, is really to invest in business opportunities, in young startups, and we have a lot of them, also in sub-Saharan Africa or East Africa. Take Kenya, take Uganda or Rwanda as examples where there are a lot of young people really energized by the opportunities, what they can do with digital means in order to start their own business. So I think this is on the positive side, but for me this whole digitalization is really a very profound transformation process, and there are also risks involved. We talked about security risk, and cybersecurity is of course an issue, but privacy rights are an extremely important issue. I mean, based on our values, I would say it is. Other countries are looking on the issue of privacy rights in a more relaxed way, but I'm not so sure everybody knows what is already possible just with the data that are available, publicly available, and how people are using it, be it in offering job opportunities or by profiling people and categorizing people based on their social media use and communication. And this is frightening for me, because as we all know, also with artificial intelligence, with all these algorithms, they tend to become racist or discriminatory if you are not careful. So I think we have also a lot to do in order to avoid the risks and to manage the risk which we see in this huge transformation process of digitalization. And of course, all the people all over the world are affected, even if they are not yet aware of this. Yeah.
So you mentioned education, health, you mentioned the business world, the business sector, and talked about some of the risks. Miguel, you're responsible for economic affairs and sustainable development, so let's focus on that business aspect perhaps, because since you also mentioned startups, how important do you think is a focus on local innovation, on local startups, rather than coming with rather biased ideas of what might be the best way to go digital? How important is it to go local, particularly on this issue?
I think it's crucial to go local. You have to see the circumstances under which people are working and living in different countries. And it's my understanding that this is what German Development Corporation is doing right now. So really to develop possibilities adapted to the different countries and their challenges. And let me say, you know, we have 220 embassies, consulates around the world. And we see it also as our task to promote startups, to establish contacts with digital companies in Germany, so to see what we can do also to foster these kind of connections. And the Agenda 2030 has been mentioned. I think in order to accomplish the objectives, we will need digitalization. No objective will be reached without making use of digitalization. And therefore, I think it's a very right strategy of the German government to look into that and to develop a real policy for that.
Cathleen, you happen to have a consulted for both of the Federal Foreign Office and the GITS prior to your current position. So now you're an external force, so to say, and can sort of comment also on what the German government, of course, is doing. Do you think, maybe not just in terms of Germany, but in terms of Europe, are we even in a position to be speaking about, you know, global agenda setting, or where do you see us, you know, in this global framework of international agenda setting in general?
How do I put this? I think one thing to start is I think we have a lot of aspirations and a lot of goodwill on the global agenda. So Germany has been, for instance, taking the lead on a lot of global digital things also, whether that's the G20 process where we initiated the Digital Ministers track, whether that's sharing the Freedom Online Coalition next year, or hosting the Internet Governance Forum in 2019. All of that is amazing, and that sets a certain principle, also because we are known also globally as protecting data protection, privacy rights, all of that, that's great. But what it also does is it raises attention and a lot of awareness to what's happened domestically. So something of being a role model or being a leader globally also means that domestically we have to have the right policies in place. And taking that step back, trying to be a bit more of a consultant in how should we go forward, it's considering legislation like what's been dubbed as the hate speech bill in the German media and also in the international media, the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz in German, or the fact that we now have extended our reach of government hacking through the Staatstrojaner with two authorities like online search and source tapping. We might have protections that allow us to scale back on some of these effects that this will have, which is privatization of enforcement, or the fact that undermining security for some, the bad actors, necessarily undermine security for all. That has consequences worldwide, and it's already had unintended consequences, whether that's Russia copying the hate speech bill one-to-one, without any oversight, without any way to actually try to rule it back because the system is not the same. The Kenyan authority has, the communications authority has already mapped their regulation guidelines on that. The current state of Kenya is probably also not the most promising for democratic standards right now. The government hacking bill, we don't have any vulnerability management process. So if we hack, if we actually exploit vulnerabilities that exist, but we don't have a way to disclose them safely to the companies to actually fix that, we're undermining our own security, and that has knock-on effects internationally. And I think that's something that we don't actually always pay attention to, and particularly in going forward and pushing for a rights-based framework globally, we need to be very aware of what we do domestically, and there needs to be more of a connection there.
So a push to, yeah, would you like to respond straight away?
No,
Sorry.
I only want to say, I think we can, if you have a look what we are already doing on behalf of the German government, especially on behalf of the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, we have worldwide already 200 projects making use of digital opportunities in the program. So I think we are already on our way. But I agree, I mean, we are talking about something like a global public good if we talk about digitalization. And this needs really also efforts on the international agenda. So we have jointly with our partners worldwide, yes, context is very important, and we are working on context to really, together with our partners on the ground, develop and invent new possibilities, new options, and new technologies. But on the other hand, as you said, of course, we have to work also jointly on a global level on joint issues which all of us are affected from. So I think it's a valid point.
Well, one attempt to work, maybe not on the global level, but in this case on the EU level, is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that comes into force in May 2018. I'll just bring it up as one example of a framework that seeks to establish certain standards, certain maybe norms of trust as well. Just for those who might have not delved into detail of the GDPR, there are some very interesting regulations within it. One, for example, is the right to explanation, which basically would require that big tech companies explain how the algorithm has reached a certain decision, which of course, as you can imagine, considering just how many algorithms and how many decisions are currently in place and are being made, could turn out to be quite consequential. So I'm wondering, with the GDPR as an example, can we think about what kinds of framework could actually help? You've mentioned security and trust quite a bit. You keep mentioning, there needs to be more cyber dialogue on a much larger level. Is the GDPR a first step, even though it's just on the EU level, for a sort of unified norm? Kathleen, what is your take on the GDPR?
Personally, I love it. I'm super excited about the fact that we've actually made that step. Like, from a German perspective, you could say it's not as strict as it used to be, but it's amazing of what we've achieved on the European level. And that's actually one of the things where I'm like, I'm so glad to be European. I'm super excited on a personal level that it comes into force. And I also think that it offers a vast area of opportunities. So come May 2018, principles like you mentioned for explanation, there are some aspects that are going to be very, very tricky to actually enforce and implement, but then there's opportunity for data portability, for instance, to actually give control back to the individual, to regain our agency and say, I don't want to be on Facebook to just pick one because everyone knows it, but I take all my data down and bring it to another platform. That's a way of decentralization and actually control and data ownership that's unprecedented. And it's sort of what I think especially government representatives also need to remember. It's not that technology is just incredibly fast, it is. But just because the law isn't in place right now doesn't mean there's no way to regulate something in hindsight. And if we do it right, and if the GDPR is implemented well also in the nation states, we might have a way to actually use this as a best practice model and try to advocate in cyber dialogues across stakeholders, not just with governments, to make that a reality and actually regain some control, which we might have lost in some aspects. You mentioned quite a few earlier.
I mean, well, sorry. Only to comment on this. I mean, we have already, together with other partners, developed the principles of digital development with these 9 principles, how to shape development, free access, and things like equal access are part of these principles, and we have more and more organizations and institutions who are adapting those principles voluntarily. Especially if I have a look on the character of what we are talking about, also the huge pace of development that we are seeing, and that you cannot foresee what is happening next. And if you have a look on global governance structures, we do not have a global government who could decide now these are the rules and regulations and could really then enforce those regulations worldwide. So what is important, according to me, is really to increase the conviction and the consciousness of a lot of stakeholders. So what are good principles to follow? But this has to be also a process bottom up, coming in order to use also all this decentralized, innovative people around in the arena. But if they are not convinced of those regulations, we need some kind of a process of a self-governing of the stakeholders, because we lack an institution which could impose a regulation, be it at the UN or other levels. This will not work. So I think working with stakeholders and trying to convince them about the risk and the opportunities, and then to adopt voluntarily regulations or let's say rules is a way, or is maybe the only way. I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, it's a slow process. I mean, we have something like the Freedom Coalition, a group of 30 countries which are like-minded. You have mentioned the United Nations. Normally, you need consensus on these things, and this makes it so difficult in order to move forward. We need the multi-stakeholder processes because I think civil society can play a very important role in these issues. But I must really say we are concerned about this growing tendency towards national security, which is interrupting economic possibilities. We see that in many important countries. So there are many governments who don't share the idea of an open and free internet. It's more about control. And this is also the backside about what we are doing in the development cooperation. You have mentioned Kenya and other countries. You can use things in a positive way, but you can also use them in order to control people. So we also have to be very careful on that. I wanted to mention one point which we are working on, which is the use of big data. So we have a project in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs where we want to use big data in order for crisis prevention. This is something innovative for the German government. We want to see if with the help of big data we can have a kind of early warning on climate change, on migration, on these kind of issues, so that the political decision makers can take early decisions on these things. This is also something that can contribute to the Agenda 2030 and these kind of policies.
So can I stick with you, Miguel, for just a second? Diplomacy, of course, and foreign policy is often about bringing together people with various norms and convictions, right? That's basically the heart of it, I think, to be able to find that common ground. You mentioned right at the beginning the examples of Russian hacking, of other types of hacking. We've mentioned a couple of security issues here. How do you think can we bring together on an international scale on this particular issue when it comes to data flows? We have, even with the US, and we don't even need to go to Russia or anywhere else, with the US and Germany, we have very different or differing convictions of data privacy. When it comes to companies' rights and propriety rights, etc., there are so many issues where there seem to be large gaps internationally. Do you think there can be, from your diplomatic experience, do you think on this particular issue there can even be an internationally sort of agreed upon agenda if we're fighting on pretty much every subtopic?
It's very challenging. It's very challenging. At least with the US, we have Privacy Shield, which is at least a step forward. But in the United Nations, we have a group of experts who are meeting regularly, where we have all the important countries included, and where we are discussing these kind of topics, also discussing confidence-building measures. But it's a slow process. As everything that is discussed in the United Nations, it is slow, you need time, you need to convince, and you need to bring in, as I said, the economy, but also the civil society in order to move processes and to generate discussions in these countries. But there is no alternative to it, and we have to avoid disruptions. And this is something that is really worrying. If you look, for example, at the way Russia meddled into the US elections, this has transformed now into very concrete sanctions of the US against the Russian economy. So these kind of things translate into dangerous developments. And the only way we can fight against that is through multilateral fora and through a slow process of trying to convince people to get along with it.
Kathleen, we heard it. Oh, yeah, please. Yeah, absolutely.
Something to add.
Absolutely, please do.
I have to say, yes, we need these processes, but something that's missing, especially when we mention the interference of Russia, how do we generate public awareness of what's going on? And how do we shape the discourse in a way that's actually useful? Because I find it very concerning if the West is starting to take fake news, fake news, fake news. There's misinformation anywhere. We don't actually, in the German elections, people felt like there was misinformation. There wasn't. Studies tell us it wasn't actually an issue. Plus, it's not new. Propaganda has been there before. And if we make this such a splash as in, oh, we have a problem with information, authoritarian governments, which are in the majority worldwide, are just going to be control. It works, just for the record. And that's difficult and it's problematic. So raising awareness of how to shape that discourse and actually everyone taking the responsibility to be conscious about what's happening and also saying, this is what I want control of as an individual, that's something that everyone can do. And I think the press has a role to play, civil society has a role to play to educate, to teach, and the private sector needs to be responsible and ethical in deciding is everything we can do really what we should do. It's also a question to address there. So I would definitely add the multilateral process. As important as it is incredibly slow, and it's not going to be successful unless there's global awareness of what's actually going on.
John wanted to underline this point. I think if we talk about an international agenda, we should not reduce the issue of international agenda on rules and regulations and security measures. We should really enlarge international agenda to the understanding that international agenda will tell us where to invest in order to achieve what you have just talked about. And if we want to achieve a general awareness, a general competence, and to enable and empower people to deal with those very complicated and very difficult issues, and each and everybody who is affected, then you need, what I said in the beginning, you need to invest in skills development, in digital skills, and that is what we are doing on a large scale in the meantime on behalf of the German government.
Since we only have a few minutes left, and since you've all been mentioning, we need to look at skills and local innovation, etc. You've mentioned a couple of cities and countries, but for those of us in the room here who might want to go and look up certain role models of where we should maybe as Germany, as Europe, look towards, since we're not always the thought leaders, I would say, on digitalization, not necessarily on certain issues. Maybe Industry 4.0 comes from the Saarland, but otherwise perhaps we could also look outwards. What are your role models? Where should we look towards when we think about an international agenda, if it's not domestically or even within Europe? So, quick round, what are your inspirational, maybe innovation hubs or startup?
I mean, I would also always suggest to have a look also in those countries which will not come into your mind immediately,
all, yeah.
If you talk about this issue. So have a look on the very innovative ecosystems which we have in Uganda or in Kenya or in Rwanda or in other places. This is one thing which is useful to have a look on in order also to see where those peoples are and where they're heading to and how they perceive the chances. I'm personally very, let's say, I just talked about, very impressed what I've seen on a 2-day trip to Israel, to Tel Aviv and to Beersheba. We having a look on blockchain technology, but also and mainly on security issues and cybersecurity issues. And if you see what is already possible and what will be possible, you get very careful in your optimism. What can we organize and what can we regulate with what we discussed before. This is really advisable for everybody to have a look. What is already possible in cybersecurity?
So be modest and maybe look at examples.
And be aware. Be aware that you will not avoid hacking, for example. There is no secure system. There is no, and then think about what are the consequences.
What a positive note to end on, maybe.
I think that be modest is a very important one. Also, question your own privilege. Like, I always feel when I travel a lot for my job that the next wave of innovation is going to come from the global south. It's not going to end with the utopianism of Silicon Valley. That's on the downfall anyways, from what I can see. At least they're questioning themselves. So it's definitely there, but also I don't know, that it comes and goes in waves, right? 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Brazil was this hub of the Marco Civil do Internet, which was amazing, the first digital rights agenda that we had. It's not been implemented in the way everyone was hoping for. There was a lot of hope, a lot of aspirations, but there's a lot there in the way this was brought about in a multi-stakeholder approach that we can learn from and that should be taken forward. Innovatively, China has impressive skills when it comes to digital things. And we might not agree with the system, and for an international agenda, as Germany, we might be like, well, not sure, but there's so much to learn on an innovation level and on the way they actually deal with digital issues. It would be naive not to look that way, just to mention one.
Yeah, in Africa, I find Rwanda very impressive. Some months ago, I was with the Minister of Economy, Ms. Cyprus, also in Kenya. to see the startup scene there, which was also impressive. So what we are trying to do through our embassies and consulates is to have a look at what is happening. And we are very interested to have or to stay in contact with the German digital community, with companies, to learn from their experience, to share experiences. And you know, we are working with the Ministry of Economy, with the Chambers of Commerce. I think we have to look at these smaller countries too. The Arab world is interesting. We just were contacted by Beirut. There are startups in Beirut which are interested in connections with Germany. So there is a lot of things are going on beyond San Francisco and Bangalore, and we have to watch that carefully.
So be modest and look outside the box, quite literally. Well, thank you very much. That's it for the International Digital Agenda. Thank you, Miguel, Christoph, and Cathleen.
Thank you.
A round of applause for you. Thank you very much.